Imagine, if you will, a scene etched in sepia tones. A grand, high-ceilinged nursery on the top floor of a London townhouse. It is 1875. The air is thick with the smell of coal dust, carbolic soap, and faintly of mildew. In a large, cold crib, a child of perhaps 18 months lies still. She is not sleeping, but she makes no sound. She has learned that crying rarely brings comfort. In the corner, a 7-year-old boy, dressed in a stiff velvet suit, stands on a stool, reciting Latin verbs to his governess. His back is straight, his expression vacant. Downstairs, his father reads the Times. His mother writes letters, both content in the knowledge that their children are being raised, correctly seen, but not heard. This tableau, so often romanticized in period dramas, hides a darker reality. The Victorian era, spanning from 1837 to 1901, was a crucible of industry, empire, and innovation. But within the sanctified walls of the home, a parallel experiment was taking place, one in child rearing. The methods employed by the Victorian middle and upper classes, and the brutal economic necessities forced upon the poor, constituted a world of parenting that, by our modern standards, would not just be considered abusive, but would be unequivocally illegal. This is not a story of monsters, but of a culture operating under a completely different set of beliefs about children, morality, disease, and discipline. It is a story of how science, religion, and social ambition conspired to create what we might call today the nursery of nightmares. Let us open that heavy oak door and step inside to understand Victorian parenting. We must first discard our modern view of childhood as a time of innocence, exploration, and inherent value. The Victorian view was profoundly different, shaped by two powerful and often conflicting forces: puritanical religion and emerging science. The legacy of the Puritan and evangelical movements cast a long shadow over the 19th century. The prevailing belief among the devout was that children were born with original sin. They were not blank slates, but willful, selfish creatures, inherently inclined towards evil. The famous Methodist preacher John Wesley encapsulated this view. Break there will betimes. Begin this work before they can run alone, before they can speak plain, or perhaps speak at all. Let a child from a year old be taught to fear the rod and to cry softly. From that age, make him do as he is bid. If you whip him 10 times running to effect it. The parent's sacred duty, therefore, was to break the will of the child. This was not seen as cruelty, but as a moral imperative, a necessary process to crush sinfulness and instill obedience, the cornerstone of salvation. A child's spirit, their individuality, their defiance, these were not traits to be nurtured, but flames to be extinguished for the good of their eternal soul. As the Industrial Revolution matured, philosophies of efficiency and utility seeped from the factory floor into the home. Jeremy Bentham's utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number, found a perverse application in child rearing. Children were seen as raw material to be processed into useful, productive members of society. Emotions were inefficient. Imagination was a distraction. The goal was to produce a disciplined, obedient, and rational adult. Love and affection were often viewed as indulgences that could spoil the final product. Britain was at the zenith of its imperial power. The ideal citizen was one who could govern distant lands, command regiments, and endure hardship without complaint. This stiff upper lip mentality was forged in the nursery. Crying was a sign of weakness. Fear was to be conquered. Emotional repression was not a psychological flaw, but a national virtue. The nursery was the boot camp for the empire. The parenting advice of Susanna Wesley, mother of John and Charles, was legendary and widely influential. She had 19 children, and her methods were brutally effective. She demanded absolute silence in her presence unless spoken to. She scheduled their lives to the minute. Disobedience was met with immediate and severe corporal punishment. She once wrote of her son John, "I insist upon conquering the will of children betimes, because this is the only strong and rational foundation of a religious education." This philosophy, to break the will, was the bedrock upon which millions of Victorian children were raised. The physical and hierarchical structure of the Victorian household reinforced these philosophies. In affluent homes, children lived a life of literal separation. The nursery suite, typically on the top floor of the house, was a world unto itself, often cold, sparsely furnished, and far from the adult living quarters. This was by design. It ensured that children would not disturb their parents with their noise or their presence. They were brought down, scrubbed and polished, for perhaps an hour in the evening to be presented to their parents, a ritual known as the children's hour. This physical distance created an emotional chasm. Parents were remote figures of authority, to be feared and obeyed, not loved and confided in. The actual work of parenting was delegated to hired staff. The hierarchy was strict. The nurse or nanny cared for the infants and younger children. Her word was law in the nursery. The governess, responsible for the education of the girls and sometimes younger boys. She was often a woman of gentle birth, but reduced circumstances, trapped in a social limbo, not a servant, but not family. This system often led to inconsistencies and, at times, profound abuse. A cruel nanny could terrorize her charges with little oversight. famous nanny from The Sound of Music, who insists on whistles for the children, is a pale, musical reflection of this authoritarian figure. Parents, detached from the day-to-day reality, often turned a blind eye, trusting in the system. For the working class and the poor, the situation was different, but no less harrowing. There was no geographical separation, because entire families often lived in a single room. The threat was not psychological repression, but physical survival. With no child labor laws for much of the era, children were economic assets. A 5-year-old could be sent into a coal mine to sit in the dark for 12 hours, opening and closing ventilation doors. A 7-year-old could be a climbing boy, forced up narrow, hot chimneys, often suffering from deformities, lung disease, and cancer of the scrotum. For these children, parenting was not about breaking the will, but about bringing in a few shillings to prevent the family from starving. The discipline was the foreman's belt and the gnawing pain of hunger. This is where Victorian parenting moves from being merely harsh to being criminally abusive by modern standards. The arsenal of discipline was extensive and cruel. Spare the rod, spoil the child was not just a saying, it was a commandment. Beating children was not just accepted, it was expected. The instruments of torture were varied. The birch rod, a bundle of birch twigs used for severe beatings, often on the bare buttocks. The cane, favored in schools, but also used at home. It left welts and could break the skin. The whip or riding crop. The pandies, from the Latin pandir, to stretch out. A punishment where the child's hand was struck with a ruler or cane. The brutality was shockingly casual. In public schools like Eton, flogging was a routine administrative task. At home, children were beaten for everything from moral transgressions, lying, disobedience, to trivial mistakes, spilling milk, poor posture. The psychological impact, the constant fear, the humiliation, the normalization of violence would today be classified as severe physical and emotional abuse. Often, the psychological punishments were more damaging than the physical ones. Solitary confinement, being locked in a dark closet or cupboard for hours, even days, was a common punishment. The terror of the dark and the isolation were used to break the spirit. Forced silence. Children could be forbidden from speaking for an entire day. Humiliation. Being forced to wear a sign detailing their sin, or having their mistake publicly announced to the household. Withholding food, meals, often bland and insufficient, could be withheld as punishment. Medical care was primitive, and a staggering belief in toughness prevailed. Children were forced to take cold baths, even in winter, to harden them. They were made to sleep with windows wide open regardless of the weather. Complaints of illness were often dismissed as malingering. There are countless tragic accounts of children dying from illnesses like scarlet fever or diphtheria that were initially dismissed as a chill or fussiness. This neglect, stemming from a philosophy that denied a child's physical vulnerability, would today be prosecuted as criminal negligence and manslaughter. The Victorian war on the child's will extend it to their very bodies. While the image of children in restrictive clothing is well known, the reality was even more dangerous. Corsets for girls, even young girls, sometimes as young as 4, were put into stay belts or lightly boned corsets to encourage good posture. By adolescence, they were laced into full corsets, compressing their ribs and internal organs, leading to fainting, deformed rib cages, and reduced lung capacity, arsenic and lead in clothing. The brilliant green dyes used in dresses and wallpapers were often arsenic-based. Children playing in rooms with arsenic-laden wallpaper or wearing these clothes would inhale the poison, leading to chronic illness and death. Lead was also commonly used in paints and toys. Perhaps one of the most horrifyingly widespread practices was the use of opiates to quiet infants and children. For the working class mother who had to return to the factory floor, or the nanny overwhelmed with too many charges, the solution was cheap, effective, and deadly. Godfrey's cordial, a mixture of opium, treacle, and spices. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup contained morphine. Street cries, 1 penny for a quiet baby. These narcotics were sold over the counter without restriction. They were used to silence hungry, teething, or simply fussy babies. The results were catastrophic. Thousands of infants died of malnutrition because they were too drugged to feed, or from direct overdose. They became listless, failed to thrive, and developed addictions. The mortality rate in the first year of life was staggering, and patent medicines were a significant contributor. Today, deliberately sedating a child with opiates would lead to immediate arrest for child endangerment, poisoning, and likely charges of murder or manslaughter. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Heroic medicine, which involved bleeding, purging, and blistering, was still practiced. A child with a fever might be bled with leeches, weakening them further. Teething was treated by lancing the gums with a dirty lancet, often introducing fatal infections. The line between medicine and abuse was virtually non-existent. Not every Victorian was blind to the suffering. Throughout the era, voices of dissent began to chip away at the monolithic edifice of traditional parenting. Earlier thinkers like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Emile, 1762, and the Romantic poets like William Wordsworth had planted the seed of a different idea. that childhood was a state of natural innocence and wonder, to be protected and nurtured. While their influence was initially limited to intellectual circles, it provided a counterargument to the doctrine of original sin. No one did more to expose the plight of children than Charles Dickens. From the brutal education of Mr. Gradgrind in Hard Times, facts alone are wanted in life, to the abuse of Oliver Twist at the workhouse and Fadgen's Den, to the emotional neglect of Pip in Great Expectations, Dickens put a human face on systemic cruelty. His descriptions of the Yorkshire schools in Nicholas Nickleby, where unwanted children were starved and beaten, caused public outrage and led to the closure of some establishments. Literature became a powerful force for social reform. Towards the end of the century, science began to turn its gaze towards the child. The field of pediatrics emerged, recognizing that children were not just small adults, but had unique physiological and psychological needs. Sigmund Freud, though his theories were controversial, began to explore the idea that childhood experiences shaped the adult personality. The trauma of the nursery was, for the first time, being considered as a source of later neurosis. Pressure from reformers led to a series of landmark laws that began to redefine society's duty to the child. The Factory Acts, 1833, 1844, 1847, gradually restricted child labor, limiting hours and setting minimum ages. The Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act, 1889, known as the Children's Charter. This was a watershed moment. For the first time, the law recognized children as beings deserving of protection from cruelty and neglect, and it gave the state the power to intervene in the family. The National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, NSPCC, was founded the following year. These laws established a revolutionary principle that the parents' right to treat their child as they saw fit was not absolute. It was the beginning of the end for the unregulated tyranny of the Victorian nursery. Let us now be explicit. If a time machine were to transport a typical upper-middle-class Victorian family to the present day, their parenting practices would trigger immediate intervention by Child Protective Services and likely lead to multiple criminal charges. Here is the indictment. The practice: routine caning, birching, and whipping. The modern law: this is unequivocal physical assault. In most Western countries, any form of corporal punishment that leaves a mark is illegal. Parents would face charges of assault causing bodily harm, and the children would be removed from the home. The practice: solitary confinement, forced silence, systematic humiliation, verbal denigration to break the will. The modern law, recognized as severe emotional and psychological abuse, causing long-term trauma. It is a primary reason for the removal of children from parental custody. The practice, denying medical care, dismissing serious illness as malingering, forcing children into dangerously cold conditions. The modern law, criminal negligence. If a child died as a result, as so many did, the parents could be charged with manslaughter or negligent homicide. The practice, administering Godfrey's cordial or other opiates to infants. The modern law. This is the administration of a controlled substance to a minor, child endangerment and poisoning. A fatal outcome would be prosecuted as murder or manslaughter. The practice, exposing children to arsenic in wallpapers and clothes, lead in paints and toys. The modern law, violation of a myriad of health and safety codes, child endangerment, and potential poisoning charges. The practice, sending a 5-year-old to work in a mine or mill. The modern law, violation of every child labor law on the books, considered a form of trafficking and slavery. The entire Victorian parenting model, from its philosophical core to its daily practices, is incompatible with modern legal and ethical standards. The character building was, in fact, trauma-inducing abuse. The legacy of Victorian parenting is a complex one. It produced generations of stoic, resilient, and often emotionally stunted individuals. The stiff upper lip that won wars also crippled intimacy and mental health. We are still, today, unraveling the intergenerational trauma passed down from those cold, top-floor nurseries. The shift away from these practices was not instantaneous. It was a slow, painful evolution driven by brave reformers, changing scientific understanding, and the hard-won recognition that children are not property, nor sinful creatures, nor raw material. They are individuals with rights, with delicate psyches, and with a fundamental need for love, security, and respect. The story of Victorian parenting is a stark reminder of how cultural norms can sanctify cruelty. It shows us that what one era considers good upbringing, another can rightly condemn as criminal abuse. It forces us to look at our own parenting practices and ask, what are the unquestioned assumptions we hold today that future generations will look back on with similar horror and disbelief? The sepia-toned portrait of the Victorian family hides the silent screams of children taught to cry softly. By listening for those echoes, we do more than just condemn the past. We reaffirm our commitment to protecting the vulnerable in the present, ensuring that the nursery is no longer a place of nightmares, but a sanctuary of safety and love.